I was halfway through laying down a fresh bed of river stones around my front yard when I heard the unmistakable clicking of heels on pavement. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. Only one person in our neighborhood wore heels to inspect other people's lawns. "Kevin," came that nasal, grating voice I'd come to loathe, "we need to talk." I stood up and wiped the sweat off my forehead. "Good morning, Harriet," I said, already bracing myself. Harriet Penmore, head of the HOA Landscaping Committee, self-appointed guardian of community aesthetics, and a woman who once fined a neighbor for putting out Halloween decorations on October 1st. Mid-50s, bleach blonde bob, and sunglasses too big for her face. She was flanked by her two lapdogs, Cynthia and Margaret, the HOA's treasurer and secretary, who nodded like bobbleheads whenever Harriet spoke. She pointed at my new landscaping with a manicured finger like she was accusing me of murder. "This is not compliant with HOA Code 4.7b regarding approved front yard materials. Decorative river stones are not permitted unless submitted for review and written approval." "I did submit it," I said. "3 weeks ago, you never got back to me," Harriet sniffed. "Then consider this your formal notice. You have 7 days to remove the stones or face a daily fine of $100. I stared at her. "You're kidding." Cynthia adjusted her clipboard. "We don't joke about compliance." I could feel my blood pressure rising, but I didn't let it show. "Fine, I'll remove them, but I want to see where it says I can't use river stones." Harriet raised her chin. "It's in the handbook." "Great," I said. "Send me a copy, I'll take a look." She turned on her heels without answering, and the three of them strutted off like they'd just won a battle. But they hadn't, not even close, because I already had a copy of that handbook. I'd read it cover to cover when I moved in 2 years ago. Nowhere did it mention anything about river stones being banned. In fact, page 32 listed river stone, mulch, gravel, and native plants as acceptable materials with no prior approval required. I wasn't mad about the stones. I was mad about the hypocrisy. You see, Harriet's backyard visible from the Greenbelt path had a koi pond, a gazebo, and a fire pit, none of which were ever submitted for HOA approval. I knew this because I used to be on the HOA board until I stepped down after the nonsense got too much. They'd picked the wrong guy to mess with. That night, I pulled out a folder I'd kept from my time on the board. Meeting minutes, emails, bylaws. I even had pictures from my neighborhood walks. And I found exactly what I needed. A record from 2 years ago where Cynthia and Margaret voted to fine a neighbor for installing a fire pit without permission. Harriet had abstained from that vote. Probably because she already had hers. By noon the next day, I had a neat little packet printed out. Photos of Harriet's unapproved backyard features, highlighted bylaws, and the meeting minutes showing their double standards. I wasn't going to argue with them. I was going to bury them in their own rules. By the time Friday rolled around, I was ready. I'd spent the last 2 nights gathering everything. Time-stamped photos of Harriet's koi pond and fire pit, screenshots of her social media page showing off her Zen backyard retreat, and HOA records I'd archived when I still had access. I even dug out the original architectural application she submitted. When she moved in, there was no mention of a pond, gazebo, or the custom lighting that now lit her fence like a Vegas marquee. At precisely 10 o'clock, I walked into the HOA's monthly open board meeting at the community clubhouse. Harriet sat at the front table, flanked by Cynthia and Margaret, each with a mug of tea and a copy of the agenda. About 20 residents were scattered across the room, most looking like they were there out of obligation rather than interest. That was about to change. "Kevin," Harriet said without looking up, flipping through her stack of papers. "If you're here to appeal your fine, you'll need to fill out Form 12D and wait until the end of the 'I'm not here to appeal anything,'" I said as I slid a stack of papers onto the table in front of her. "I'm here to report a violation." That got her attention. Residents started turning in their seats. Harriet leaned back and folded her arms. Suddenly wary, I pointed to the cover page. "Section 6, Paragraph 3 of the HOA Charter states that any permanent structural addition to a yard must be approved in writing by the Architectural Committee. I flipped the page. Here's a picture of your koi pond taken from the Greenbelt Trail last Tuesday. And here's your original application from when you moved in, no mention of a pond, a gazebo, or a fire pit. Cynthia's eyes widened. Margaret leaned over to look, visibly uncomfortable. I'd like these violations to be formally reviewed by the board, I continued, and any appropriate penalties applied just as you did with the Ramirez family's backyard improvement 2 years ago, which I've included here for reference. Harriet's voice was tight. This is a personal attack. No, I said, keeping my voice calm. It's a request for equal enforcement of the rules. Either the bylaws apply to everyone or they apply to no one. That got a few murmurs from the crowd. She tried to pivot. This isn't the forum for this. We'll schedule a private review. You hold public meetings to discuss violations every month. This is the forum. That's when something interesting happened. Someone at the back of the room raised their hand. It was Mr. Albright, a retired postal inspector who'd lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. I'd like to second Kevin's request, he said, and add something. My wife and I submitted an application for a modest pergola last fall. We never got a response, but we saw Harriet's gazebo go up a few weeks later. Seemed selective. Heads turned. People started whispering. Harriet's face tightened. We're not obligated to respond to every application immediately. I have a right to a timeline, Albright said. That's in the charter. Margaret looked increasingly nervous. She leaned towards Cynthia and whispered something. Cynthia's usual clipboard confidence was gone. She tapped her pen against the table in a rapid rhythm. Harriet tried to regain control. This meeting is out of order. Unless you're a board member, I was, I said. Until I resigned last year, which means I know exactly how this is supposed to go. I turned to the audience. If anyone else has had a permit delayed or denied without explanation, now's a good time to speak up. That was the spark. One by one, people began raising their hands. Miss Tran, whose rose garden had been ripped out by HOA landscapers without warning. The Marshalls, who'd been fined $300 for a fence that was 2 inches too high while Harriet's back gate had a decorative archway that clearly exceeded the limit. Even the Wews, who'd been told their solar panels were too reflective, spoke up. I was told to remove mine, Mr. Wu said, but hers have been up for years. By now, the clubhouse was buzzing. Harriet rose to her feet. This is turning into a witch hunt. It's a request for transparency, I said, and I think we're entitled to it. Someone from the back called out, put it to a vote. That shut her up. According to the HOA charter, if a quorum of residents requested a special review of board conduct, it had to be scheduled within 30 days. I'd done the math on the way and we had more than enough signatures right there in the room, so we did. Right then and there, I circulated a petition calling for a formal review of the board's actions over the past 2 years. By the time the meeting ended, I had 34 signatures, 10 more than required. But that wasn't the end of it. Later that evening, I received an anonymous manila envelope slipped under my front door. Inside were printed email exchanges between Harriet and a local contractor dated 6 months prior discussing expedited work on her backyard, with clear instruction not to file permits with the city. The emails were signed. There were even payment records. That changed everything. I called a friend of mine from college, now a city code enforcement officer, and asked if he could take a look. He agreed to discreetly review the documents. 2 days later, he called me back. Kevin, you're sitting on a violation trifecta. No permits, unlicensed contractor, and electrical work done without inspection. That's a city hazard. That same day, he forwarded the case to the city's building compliance department. The investigation was officially opened within 48 hours. A week later, city inspectors showed up with clipboards and cameras. Harriet tried to block them at the gate, but they handed her a notice of inspection signed by a municipal judge. She had no choice but to let them in. They found enough violations to fill a binder. The koi pond was illegally plumbed into the city's water system. The fire pit had a buried gas line that was never inspected. The gazebo's footings were poured directly over a storm drain, and the outdoor lighting, wired into the community's shared electrical grid, that last one was theft. The city notified the county prosecutor. What had started as a petty landscaping fine had now crossed into criminal territory: unauthorized utility use, permit fraud, and contractor misrepresentation. A formal complaint was filed with the district attorney's office. The next HOA meeting was packed. Standing room only. A city official stood at the front and laid it all out. Residents' faces shifted from confusion to disbelief to outrage. Harriet sat frozen. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The board was ordered to call a special election to replace any officer under active investigation. Harriet, Cynthia, and Margaret were all named. Their resignations were read aloud a week later. That might have been the end, but it wasn't enough for the neighborhood. People were furious, not just at the hypocrisy, but at the money. HOA funds had been used to pay for consulting services, some of which were traced back to a shell company run by Cynthia's nephew. More digging revealed inflated landscaping contracts and unauthorized legal fees. Residents rallied. A committee was formed to audit the HOA's books. I was asked to serve on it. I agreed on one condition: complete transparency. Every transaction would be posted online. Every decision would require a vote. The audit uncovered over $22,000 in misused funds. The new board voted unanimously to press charges. Harriet and Cynthia are currently facing civil litigation for breach of fiduciary duty and misuse of community funds. Margaret took a plea deal and agreed to testify in exchange for leniency. As for me, my river stones are still there. And now they're joined by a small wooden sign that reads, "Compliance begins with accountability." The funny thing, I never wanted to be a crusader, I just wanted a peaceful yard. But when someone tries to weaponize rules to serve themselves, the only response is to make sure the rules apply to them too. And this time they did. The neighborhood was different now. In the weeks following the resignations and the city's investigation, our community transformed from a place where people ducked their heads and hoped not to be noticed into one where neighbors gathered in driveways, shared updates, and asked questions out loud. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid of the HOA, they were watching it. Still, I had a hunch there was more buried under the surface. During the audit committee's review, we discovered something strange. A recurring consultant fee listed under Landscape Aesthetic Advisory, billed monthly in exact amounts. The payments had started roughly 18 months ago and were made to a company called Grayvale Solutions. None of us had ever heard of it. No one recalled approving it, and the name didn't appear in any of the old board meeting minutes. I brought it up during our third audit meeting, seated around a folding table in the clubhouse's side room. "Anyone know who's behind Grayvale?" Mrs. Rowley, a retired tax attorney who joined the review team, leaned forward. I did a search through the state's business registry. Grayvale's listed under a trust in Delaware, no ownership disclosures, classic shell. "Any chance it ties back to Harriet or Cynthia?" I asked. She pushed a manila folder across the table. "Look at the wiring details. The routing number on the checks matches an account linked to Tidecrest Management. That's a small property firm in the next county over. The registered agent, a man named Ellis Penmore," I blinked. "Harriet's husband." There was a silence. Then Mr. Albright spoke. "They funneled HOA funds into their own pockets under a fake advisory contract. That's embezzlement." We contacted the district attorney's office again. This time, they didn't just request documents, they issued subpoenas. 2 days later, detectives from the county's financial crimes unit showed up at Harriet's house with a search warrant. They left with boxes of files, 2 laptops, and a desktop tower. One officer politely asked if we could provide the HOA's bank statements. We handed over a flash drive with everything. 3 weeks passed. Then we got the call. The DA had opened a formal case. The charges included wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The city attorney also filed a civil complaint to recover misappropriated HOA funds. Harriet and Ellis were both named. Cynthia was included for her part in authorizing payments without proper board votes, but that wasn't all. During the investigation, they uncovered records showing that several of the fines issued by Harriet's board, nearly 50 in total, had been collected by check, with residents told to make payments to HOA compliance account. That account didn't exist in the HOA's official ledger. It was a personal account registered to Margaret. It took less than a week for the fraud unit to secure charges against her as well: mail fraud, misrepresentation, and theft. When they arrested her at her home, she reportedly tried to claim she had been just following Harriet's instructions. The fallout was swift. The court appointed a financial conservator to oversee the HOA's accounts while the civil trial proceeded. The new board, filled with actual residents who'd volunteered after the shake-up, worked with a local law firm to file a separate class action suit on behalf of the fined residents. I testified as a witness, not just about the financial misconduct, but about the culture of intimidation that allowed it to thrive. The day I walked into the county courthouse to give my deposition, I passed Harriet in the hallway. She sat alone on a bench in a gray blazer, her hair grown out with dark roots showing. She looked up as I passed, but said nothing. I didn't stop. Inside, the district attorney's lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire Mendoza, greeted me with a nod. "We've got enough to move forward with felony charges. Your records were airtight." "I figured they wouldn't cover their tracks too well," I said. "They didn't," Claire replied, "but your documentation made the difference. You showed a pattern." As I gave my sworn statement, I detailed everything: how Harriet had targeted residents with arbitrary fines, ignored applications, and used her position to silence dissent. I explained how the board had never voted on the so-called consulting contracts, and how I'd cross-referenced every payment with a timeline of her backyard renovations and personal spending. After the deposition, Claire added, "The judge has already frozen their assets pending trial. We're pursuing full restitution." Back in the neighborhood, word spread fast. People who'd once been reluctant to speak out now talked freely. One neighbor, an ICU nurse who'd been fined during the pandemic for parking her car inappropriately, showed up at a community meeting and offered to help with legal research. Another neighbor, a mechanic who'd been threatened with fines over a covered trailer, volunteered to repaint the community benches. For the first time since moving in, I saw what this place could be when people were treated like neighbors instead of subjects. Then came the sentencing. Harriet and Ellis were convicted of multiple counts of embezzlement and wire fraud. Harriet was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, with mandatory restitution of over $24,000. Ellis received 2 years probation and was barred from managing any financial accounts tied to housing associations. Cynthia took a plea deal: 6 months of community service and a full confession, which she read aloud in court. Margaret, after initially resisting, agreed to full restitution and a suspended sentence in exchange for turning over detailed records of every illegitimate fine she'd processed. Those records were a gold mine. Turns out, some of the money had gone toward luxury hotel stays, a cruise, and even a down payment on a car. The outrage exploded. Residents demanded a full accounting, and the court ordered a public restitution plan. Each affected resident received a refund check, including interest. For some, it was only a few $100s. For others, it was over $1,000. I didn't take any of the settlement money offered to me. I donated it back to the neighborhood improvement fund we'd started under the new board. One afternoon, I stood beside Mr. Albright and Mrs. Roly as we unveiled the new community notice board, complete with transparent meeting schedules, financial updates, and a section for open resident feedback. "That's how you keep them honest," Albright said, tapping the glass frame. Roly nodded. "Sunlight's the best disinfectant," I added, "and cameras." We all laughed. Because yes, we'd also installed 4 new community-monitored security cameras, one trained right on the HOA office. Nobody in charge now had anything to hide. Later that month, we held a cookout in the cul-de-sac. Neighbors brought folding chairs, coolers, and homemade dishes. Kids ran between sprinklers. Someone brought a karaoke machine. For the first time, it felt like a neighborhood again, not a battle zone. A younger couple who just moved in approached me near the grill. "We heard about what happened with the old HOA," the husband said. "We were warned by our realtor, actually, said the board used to be intense." "Let's just say it's a different place now," I said, passing him a plate. His wife smiled. "We were nervous about moving here. But after hearing what you all did, how you stood up, I think we made the right choice." That night, I sat on my porch, watching the lights dim across the street as people turned in. I looked at my yard, the river stones still exactly where I'd placed them. A wind chime rang gently overhead. We hadn't just removed a corrupt board. We'd reclaimed our neighborhood. And this time, we weren't letting go. The new board held its first quarterly town hall in the park near the east entrance, beneath a rented canopy and flanked by folding chairs borrowed from the community center. A few dozen residents showed up, some curious, others cautious. There was a polite hush as the meeting began, but that didn't last long. People were finally ready to talk. I sat beside 2 other volunteers from the audit committee while the new board president, a quiet but sharp-minded woman named Cara Mullins, stood at a portable podium. She was a civil engineer by trade, organized, measured, and allergic to drama. Exactly what we needed. "We've completed our financial audit for the last 3 years, Cara said, flipping through a report. "There's one last item we need to address." The crowd leaned in. Cara glanced at me, then at the printouts in her folder. During the review, we discovered a series of payments labeled emergency infrastructure repair, totaling over $63,000. These payments were made to a company that, as far as we can tell, does not exist under any licensed contractor registry in the state. The address listed is a P.O. box in a neighboring town. The checks were signed by the previous treasurer. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Cara continued, "We consulted a forensic accountant. The P.O. box is connected to a personal bank account belonging to a man named Daniel Fulton. He's the brother-in-law of the former secretary." People began murmuring. I saw Mr. Albright's brow furrow. "Here's where it gets worse," Cara said, her voice steady. "The funds were drawn from the HOA's deferred maintenance reserve, the one set aside for actual emergencies. That account is now nearly empty." A woman in the front row stood up. "That fund was for the storm drains. We voted to set that aside when the engineers said the old ones were corroding." Cara nodded. "Exactly. And that's why we've referred the case to the county's major fraud division and the state licensing board. The district attorney's office has already begun a formal investigation." The crowd broke into tense whispers. Cara waited until the noise died down. "We're not just dealing with mismanagement anymore," she said. "This is fraud on a scale that affects every homeowner here, and it could have endangered the neighborhood if we'd had a major storm." I stood and stepped forward. "There's something else." Cara motioned for me to speak. I turned to face the residents. "I ran a background check on Daniel Fulton after his name came up. He's not just unlicensed. He's previously been investigated for construction scams in 2 other counties. He signs short-term leases on P.O. boxes and has a pattern of targeting small associations with loose oversight. He's already on the state's radar, and now he's on ours." A man near the back, someone I didn't recognize, let out a low whistle. "So we've been funding a ghost company." "More like a money laundering pipeline," I said. And the former board members who signed off on it either knew or didn't care. Another resident stood up. "What happens now?" Kara answered. "The DA has frozen the personal accounts of the involved individuals. They've also subpoenaed the HOA's full transaction history, which we've already provided. If charges are filed, and we expect they will be, those responsible will face felony fraud charges." That evening, the meeting ended with an air of uneasy satisfaction. Justice was finally taking root, but the ground was still soft. 2 weeks later, subpoenas were served. The former secretary, Margaret, had already been cooperating due to her earlier plea deal. But after the subpoenas for financial fraud went out, she turned over even more documents, including a handwritten ledger she claimed belonged to Cynthia. It was messy ink smears, shorthand notations, but it included dates, names, and bank routing numbers that matched the forensic accountant's findings. The ledger also revealed something none of us expected: 2 payments made to a private investigator. The description next to each was short and chilling: Kevin S. and Albright. I called Kara the moment I saw the scans. "They hired someone to dig into us." "Why?" she asked. "To intimidate or discredit us?" "Probably both." We brought the new evidence to Claire Mendoza, the prosecutor overseeing the case. She met us in a glass-walled conference room at the DA's office, her sleeves rolled up and a yellow legal pad in front of her. "We've already confirmed that the payments were routed through the same shell account. That connects the fraudulent financial activity with attempts to obstruct the investigation," Claire said. "That bumps this into a higher sentencing range." Kara frowned. "Is that enough to get them remanded?" Claire tapped her pen. "For Harriet and Cynthia? Yes, I'm filing a motion to revoke their bail. They'll be taken into custody by the end of the week." And they were. The arrests made the local news. A reporter from Channel 9 ran a segment titled HOA Havoc. Local leaders accused of fraud and intimidation, standing in front of the community sign. The new board issued a statement emphasizing transparency and cooperation with law enforcement. I opted not to speak on camera. I'd had enough of spotlights. I just wanted the repairs funded and the neighborhood safe again. The civil trial took 5 days. The evidence was overwhelming: bank records, emails, Margaret's ledger, and even testimony from the private investigator, who admitted under oath that he had been hired to dig up dirt, but found nothing actionable. The judge ruled in favor of the HOA and ordered restitution of the full $63,000, along with punitive damages. Combined with the earlier embezzlement case, the former board members were now liable for nearly $90,000 in total. Cynthia and Harriet were sentenced to 2 years in state prison, with an additional 5 years of probation. Fulton was arrested in another state and charged with multiple counts of fraud. Extradition was pending. Margaret's cooperation earned her a suspended sentence and a permanent ban from holding any financial position in any community organization. After the sentencing, the neighborhood held a vote to amend the HOA bylaws. Kara drafted the proposal, and I helped refine the language. The amendments limited board terms to 2 years, required third-party audits every fiscal year, and mandated public posting of all financial decisions. The vote passed unanimously. The storm drain project, once neglected, was finally approved for repair. A legitimate contractor licensed, bonded, and recommended by the city began work within 3 weeks. The money came from a combination of reserve rebuilding and a small grant the city provided after reviewing the fraud case. Every time I walked the dog past the construction, I felt something settle inside me. Not pride, not relief, just stillness. Like the balance had been restored on the first weekend of spring the community organized a cleanup day. Not because anyone mandated it, but because people wanted to help. I spent the morning patching a few bare spots in the grass near the clubhouse, then joined Kara and a few others as they set up a new bulletin board. This one was different. It wasn't just for announcements. It included a rotating photo display of resident gardens, volunteer opportunities, and a posted QR code linking to the HOA's budget dashboard. "Transparency looks good on us," Kara said, pinning up the first photo Mr. Wu's solar-lit flowerbed. "It's overdue," I said. As the sun dipped low, more neighbors arrived, some bringing snacks, others just stopping by to talk. Music played from a wireless speaker. Kids chased each other around the swings. The air was warm and the laughter real. No one mentioned Harriet or Cynthia or what had happened. They didn't need to. The damage had been repaired, the rot exposed, and the roots of this neighborhood were growing back stronger than before. I stood beside the new bulletin board, arms crossed, watching the sun hit the tops of the newly trimmed trees. River stones lined the pathway beside me, the same ones I'd fought to keep. And this time, nobody dared say a word.